I mean, people today very frequently say, you know, money makes the world go round. You know, without Wall Street, there's no economy. Now, if you think about it a little bit, you realize, no, gravity makes the world go round. If you have an economy, it means that, you know, if you get rid of all of the engineers, yeah, then you don't have an economy. If you get rid of Wall Street, well, that's a bunch of financial services. There's nothing really being provided. If you look at what sustains our productivity, our human population stability, the financial services aspect of the economy really has very little to do with that. If anything, it's a parasite sucking that down. So there's no real value in that sense when you think about the real parameters defining life and human life on top of that in the universe, in money. And not that long ago, people understood that. It was, you know, I like using this anecdote, but at my grandmother's house, she has a set of encyclopedias that were published in 1969. And in that set, there's a description under the heading of Mars, which describes how by the year 1984 or maybe 85, the first colony should already be established according to those policies then in action in that point. Keeping in mind that in 1969 was a year following the first human being actually stepping foot onto onto the moon. All of the program of John F. Kennedy wasn't yet destroyed, both on the nuclear fusion investment orientation nor in the broader space-based economy orientation, which were the norm. And that was what drove the economy. And when you were doing that, and people were actually in a state where you were always thinking about how to make things better, it was very difficult to fall into the trap of believing that, oh, money's the source of my economy. No. You know, your children, your science, what are you doing for the future is the source of your economy. And so what we're facing today is really a crisis, not so much, well, we do have a physical crisis. Yes, our infrastructure is breaking down. Yes, people are getting stupider. Yes, we are facing a war. So we do have certain real physical parameters that are a crisis. But the real root of these crises, none of these would be crises were there not a deeper problem in thinking. Certain concepts which today have become standard doctrine, you know, popular opinion, which people calibrate their behavior, their plans, their self-identities to, are based on provably fraudulent assumptions about fundamental ideas of the universe, both of the nature of man, the nature of reality, perception, government. So there's basic ideas which organize the invisible structures of political and economic law that define our existence, which are provably absurd. And yet, because people have developed a very lazy-minded set of behavioral patterns through a really shitty culture, shitty education system, which shouldn't be too shocking for if anybody's actually here and thought about this. Because of that, they are not looking deeper beyond the surface of things and are not judging through their own powers of reason the absurdity of these assumptions. Money being valuable is one of them. There's a variety of others. Now, LaRouche laid out a very, very tight introduction, at the very least, for I think most people, to his general epistemology, and that which makes this organization very unique in history. Oh, sorry, Dave, what?
No, sorry.
Okay. And the point that I'm going to try to introduce in the class will be to just add a little bit of meat on the bones, because it requires a lot of work. To hear this is one thing, to believe it is another thing, and to actually understand why this belief is actually more reasonable than anything else is yet another thing still. So what we're going to do today is just to take a little journey through a proof using a series of resources on the imperial fraud of entropy and why the idea of value needs to be redefined around a competent conception of natural law, and that natural law could in itself only be proven if it is understood that entropy is false. Who here knows what entropy is? Who has come across this word before? Who is not a member? You come across this word? Not come across this word?
I was going to ask the question what it is.
Beautiful, okay. All right, I'm not going to answer that right yet, but I'm going to jump on that. Okay, so I'll begin by taking two key quotes at the beginning of my class here, just to create a certain counterpoint, a contrast of two the effects of a concept that is rooted in a belief in entropy and anti-entropy. The fact that we just listened to LaRouche also, yeah, sort of puts us in the place of the anti-entropy mindset. But let's use this quote here from 2011 by Mr. LaRouche, which I'll then counterpoint to one other person as the opposite of that. So on the nature of men, okay, LaRouche wrote, and has been trying to explain for a long time, that most of the raw materials on which civilization depends today are found in fossil remains, such as iron deposits, left behind by deceased forms of what had been living processes. Thus, when we gather up and employ iron ores, we are depleting the density of the forms of ores left behind by long-deceased expressions of life concentrated in certain environments in this manner. You know, he's talking, you guys all see that in nature? Okay. Hence, to overcome the loss of richness of such resources left behind, we must act in ways which have the effect of increasing the equivalent of the energy flux density of the sources of heat power applied to production for human needs. This pattern of proceeding from raw materials and heat processes of relatively lower to higher orders of energy flux density has been the basis for every case of the society's ability to maintain its population's ability to maintain an improved or even a constant level of potential relative population density. That is a mouthful. Did everyone generally get the idea, or should I maybe extrapolate a little bit of what he meant? Basically, when you're facing any new iron ore deposit or any ore deposit, at first it's going to be somewhat easy to extract what's there. It's going to be a very dense bulk, so it's very easy. Now, but if you continue using a certain low-level set of technologies to extract it for whatever needs your society has, then at a certain point it'll become more and more diffused with other, rocks and other soils and things that make it really hard to make it economically viable to continue that process. And you abandon the mine or whatever, right? You just have to leave it. Now, if you come up with a new technology by developing a better form, a new technology that uses a greater density of heat, all of a sudden you have more freedom to start extracting these irons or what have you that you would normally otherwise have to abandon with a lower source. But the fact is that these things are always going to be, on the one hand, limited. If you always just stay with one type of ore, you're fucked, right? Because there's only so many ores to go around, and at a certain point, these things will collapse. And you have to also recognize that as you move from these new technologies, from something lower of a lower quality to a higher quality of heat, well, your population is going to have some effects too, right? Your potential to sustain more people is going to increase, not decrease, with these innovations, right? So people can say, well, okay, that's technology. I don't believe in technology. Technology is destroying the world. Right? Look at Africa. Isn't that caused by technology? If we weren't raping all the resources, wouldn't they be in a utopic place? Well, no, that's not true, because what you're looking at, what's causing technology, right? Technology is not a thing in and of itself. It's an effect of an immaterial process. And that immaterial process, what allows it to improve, is not the technology itself. There's something else. There's a certain concept, a certain quality or power of mind, which we're going to have to get more familiar with. Now, who's somebody who doesn't believe in that power of mind? And what is the effect of the thinking if you don't believe in the power of scientific and technological progress? What opinions, if you follow through your logical consequences of not believing that there is this power and that this is what defines human nature? Well, you're going to be thinking a lot like this guy. Now not everyone has taken this to the logical conclusion, but some people have, and for those who have, it's useful to just read their writings and think how they are thinking. So, everybody knows who this guy is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, the guy who said that he'd like to, if he were reborn in the next life, come back as a deadly virus to solve overpopulation, wrote in an spoke in an interview to People magazine that human population growth is probably the single most serious long-term threat to survival. We're in for a major disaster if it isn't curbed, not just for the natural world, but for the human world. The more people there are, the more resources they'll consume. the more pollution they'll create, the more fighting they will do. We have no option. If it isn't controlled voluntarily, it will be controlled involuntarily by an increase in disease, starvation, and war.
That is exactly what Thomas Malthus said.
Mm-hmm.
And if he wants to be born, and he wants to be reborn as a deadly virus, I want to be reborn as the cure of this guy. That way I can like inject it and like I can just like strangle him in this virus form.
That's good.
It's also interesting that he says we have no option. It's not.
Yeah, it's not a maybe. It's a
It's
very
not like he's
absolute.
saying. He's not saying, oh, we have pollution problems, or because it's true. If you take all the oil, then there's no more oil left. That's a fact. But we know better. But he says there's no option to this. So what are you going to do? Well, you can control your people, since you can't control their tendency to grab resources. Control the people.
Okay. Now this is not. It's at first experience, at first sight, this is somewhat gross for anybody with a bit of conscience and a bit of morality. This is somewhat disturbing and dissonant to listen to. But if you think about it a little deeper, it's not always the easiest thing to immediately refute. Like, who here wants to believe that?
Ben, si tu crois à l'offre et la demande, right?
If you believe that, yeah, if you believe in supply and demand and monetarism, yeah, you're probably going to necessarily have to conclude in that. But how would you fully conclude that
It's not
that's...
necessarily self-evident though as well with the supply and demand for.
No, I'm saying that if you think it through, the conclusions of belief in supply and demand and monetarism...
You know, I'm saying for anybody who doesn't necessarily know what those things are, it's not.
Okay, well, this itself is not self-evidently not true. Like, does anybody here see why it's really hard? It's somewhat hard at first to...
many times.
Yeah, but it's somewhat hard to disprove that. Like, do you find it difficult? Yeah,
Well, my argument will be it's the manner in which you consume can also be altered, and the way you live, and like the way you manage your environment. Not in terms of this population reduction is the answer, I guess, that he's suggesting. But I mean, if everybody starts being careful about their trash, you won't be living in a trash pile, for example. There's ways to change behaviors, not change the population amount, let's say.
And,
That will just retard the moment where surpopulation will be a problem, you know?
well,
Hold on, Salim. One sec.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But if you imagine, like, you're saying, like, if the population was completely fixed right now, right? Like, it's stabilized, no more growth of population, but everyone just was more careful about how they consumed and wasted, we could avoid this type of conclusion?
Well, I mean, like what I would say, like I don't want to take too much of the floor, but
okay.
what I would say is the most important need we have is, let's say, food. I would think, in terms of resources, food, and right now we are not producing food in like the way we're producing food is by far the most efficient way to do it. So why not focus on that before thinking, okay, well, there's not enough food for everyone. Like, I would think.
Even if you have, like, the certain quantity of food production that's more wisely done, and let's say we did everything else wiser in terms of, like, our relationship to water, fossil fuels, the ores that make up our life. Even if we were doing them in the wisest possible ways, but maintained a certain relationship to the quantity of fresh water available and the quantity of fresh ores and stuff like that available, even if that was done at the best, the fact is that by virtue of just sustaining a population in time, requires these things to still disappear in time.
What does that mean also by the best? Because with our current technology, it's not the best. So we have to advance the technology.
Well, I guess self-sustain, like a technology that would create self-sustaining production, right?
And that's why there's no real such thing when you actually look at the fact that if you don't improve your technology, get out of your fixed technology base, if you don't do that to something more efficient, then you will always create a collapse point sometime in the future. You can maybe push that collapse point down by conserving more or whatever else, or readjusting certain types of behavioral patterns, but if you stay within that same technological base, that collapse point is only going to be moved down into the future.
Well, I mean,
So to actually get out of that mindset where we can think about a perpetual society of progress, where there's no question of just moving the death point a little further away from us, requires that we recognize the fallacy underlying the belief in entropy. Bertrand Russell, who's a major aristocratic intellectual that Bush has been hammering at increasingly over the past couple of weeks, but really for the past several decades, wrote that there is one supremely important law which is only statistical. This is the second law of thermodynamics. It states, roughly speaking, that the world is growing continuously more disorderly. Bertrand Russell. Okay, so when people say today, oh yeah, okay, sure, things are getting worse, yeah, okay, the economy's doing pretty bad, but hasn't it always been kind of getting a little worse? Like, isn't that just the way the world works? It's dog-eat-dog world, What they're actually saying is that they're infected by a pervasive belief that that anti-progress is the dominant force in the world, that disorder is more powerful than order, or that chaos is what dominates any appearance or semblance of an organized system. Now, we're going to look at how this is the most important thing to do politically. A lot of people say, oh, I like liberal politics, I like thinking about impeaching Obama, I like talking about the oligarchy, September 11th. They like things, but when it comes to actually dealing with science, people tend to very frequently block, and they don't realize how is this investigation to the battle in science directly responsible for shaping the political world in which we live. And that's why we don't want to get caught in that trap. And what we'll do today is look at the formation of this pervasive belief, since entropy, if you go to any physics program or biology program or neuroscience program, you're going to find that there is in the textbooks, and you can talk to the professors, and if you try to challenge the belief in entropy, you will get rageful backlashes. It's completely pervasive.
It's worth maybe mentioning, because I confronted David Suzuki on this question. He was at this Occupy Montreal rally. And this is the thing, right, that he says we have to accept the fact of overpopulation. It was you who told me you had heard this. He says, because of the second law of thermodynamics, like, this, you have to accept that, number one. All the arguments are based on that. And so I went up to him and I said, hey Dave, I think we have to get rid of the second law of thermodynamics. And he said, what? And he actually freaked out, right away. He's like, you're crazy. Why don't we get rid of the speed of light? Why don't we get rid of gravity? And I said, well, because I just started to explain to him this question of evolution of life, Bernousski quick fast, and how evolution defies entropy. And he just completely told me off. He didn't want to have any discussion on that. It was vicious, but just to say, because I said, you're saying the world is overpopulated. I was like, that's why I'm talking about that. And he just he was brushing me off. He didn't want to talk to me. And so that's when I brought up, well, how many people do you think the planet can sustain? And he wasn't answering me. And I said, how many people do you think the planet can sustain? And then he said 200 million. And he said it in a really 200 million.
Yeah, he's concluded this already.
And then he told me to fuck off, literally. And that's what that conclusion brought him to, right? So he's saying you have to accept that. And then his reasoning is saying 200 million people is what the planet should be allowed to have.
You'd kill in excess of 95% of the population. What makes you think he's so special to be one of those survivors?
Well, that's the thing, right? The guys who believe it,
5%.
yeah, the guys who promote this at the top don't obviously want to abide by their own theory. They don't live according to their own ideals.
They want to drive their cars, they want to fly their planes, they want their TV, they want their everything else of every creature comfort imaginable. It's just you have to live in this hovel and crap in a hole all day long.
Well said. So what we'll do is actually here, to get a sense of the origin of this idea, how it developed and how it was perverted to advance this political agenda, I figured what we'd do first would be to look at how it began in a completely different way than people imagined. This didn't just come out of the blue, fully formed as a justification for killing off 90% of the world population and advance an empire. Now, originally, the original concept of it came about as a discovery of economy. There was a challenge that a very important and great scientist named Sadi Carnot took on, which was to figure out how much work can you get from a certain amount, let's say a ton of coal, because France wanted to develop itself. It was applying very American system policies in this period And they want to figure out, well, what's the difference if you take a machine, two designs of a machine that does one job. You have two different types of steam engines, but in one engine, when the same quantity of energy of like coal is burned, you get out more work than the other one. What is it about the internal design, even though the machines fulfill the same function, they use the same amount of energy input, right, same amount of heat, why is it that one will do more work more efficiently, will use that energy more efficiently than the other one? So there's something about the design, right, that will result in a greater power to accomplish work. Now, he observed, and this is called Sadi-Calno's principle. People today, if you go to Wikipedia, they'll say, oh, entropy comes from Sadi-Calno's principle. Sadi-Calno was the first one to prove it, but then it was just advanced and redefined a little bit later by some other people. But he was the first. Now, that's not true. Sadi-Calno simply was looking at machines, physical machines that had pistons, moving parts, and observed that, okay, you have these properties. You have the fact that within it, you have heat that moves always from hot to cold. You're not going to, if you bring in heat and, that heat is absorbed into ice, you're not going to get that heat back out again, and it's irreversible. That's one. You've got engines being engines. They're not themselves going to become a better quality of engine themselves, so they're closed systems. The engine isn't going to find a better way to reorganize itself to be more efficient. So they're as closed systems, well, they're going to increase in entropy. What does that mean? That just means when you put in more energy, when you put in a certain amount of heat to make the pistons move, you put a certain amount of fuel in your gas tank, and that burns. Well, your car is always going to be using up more energy than is being consumed, so that than it was there at the beginning. So you're always moving towards a state where there's no more gas in your gas tank. You got to go back to the gas station, pump it up again. So based on a certain fixed amount of energy input, you're always going to be wasting certain amounts of energy. And as an engine, it's also a cycle. It comes back to square one, it does it again. Right? It's a repetition. Now,
yeah,
he was...
I would just add that, like, mainly also the question is, all the fuel that you put in the car is not only going to go to move the car, but there's going to be heat produced from the engine,
yeah,
which is not making the car move faster or anything. Yeah. It's just a loss.
That's right.
Yeah.
So what you have is you basically have a steamer that boils. So you have a boiler that creates steam. So you have a certain amount of heat that has to boil some water. Like we're dealing with a steam engine, right? And then that water is then condensed, called condenser. That condenser is then taking that potential energy and applying it now into the machine to start moving the pistons. And as Pascal said, the very act of all of this friction is causing heat itself to be lost. So by the end, you're accomplishing a certain amount of work from your machine, but if you try to now take that work and make another machine that's similarly designed to run, it will never be able to produce or have the same amount of work. There's always going to be less work accomplished than the amount of work that went into creating the heat to make the thing operate to begin with. So there's always going to be a little bit more of a loss. If there wasn't, if you had a full 100% transfer of the boiler, of the steamer to the boiler to the condenser to the machine, if that was no loss whatsoever, you would have a perpetual motion machine. You could always feasibly imagine that continuously just going back into itself,
yeah.
And that machine would never run down if there was no friction, no heat loss, and you could imagine a system working like that forever.
That would be impossible.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but if I was somehow able to do it, you'd probably need no never mind.
So what we've got here is anytime that there's any motion within the physical material universe, you're going to have certain amounts of heat that's required to make things move and certain loss. Okay, but that's applicable to steam engines. That's applicable to any closed system. The problem was, a few years later, the oligarchy got wind of this idea and started thinking about how the hell they could use this to advance a very evil agenda, and started paying groupings of scientists a lot of money and promoting the hell out of them to universalize this. To say, okay, this thing that we see in the steam engine, this is actually the way the entire universe works, with no other evidence than the fact that they just said it. So you have, I threw up two examples here that come out in LaRouche's writings a lot. A lot of our science work has been, you'll just encounter these names the more you guys work through this. Hermann von Helmholtz, Rudolf Clausius, you've got Boltzmann. And Clausius was, I think, the first guy to actually say, okay, this is completely universal. The whole universe is effectively dying as such. It's a closed system. We see cycles, day, night, rhythms, you know. But there's a certain fixed amount of energy. There's no more energy that's ever going to be created. And so any type of increase of new action within this universe means that there's less energy to go around, naturally, right? If there's more life on the earth, if there's more babies being produced, if there's more people than, you know, there were like last generation, that just means that each one of these things requires more energy, means that they're sucking out the energy from other parts of the universe and speeding up the death of the universe, fundamentally. You take it to its logical conclusion.
Yeah, and maybe this is a bit off topic, but why are all of these guys, they generally have an unbelievably creepy side. I mean, I'm looking at this guy over there, he's like, get out, or else I just killed my wife here.
Well, that's what you're going to find. All these guys are very, very... No, honestly, what you just said is actually interesting, because when you look at the lives of these people, they're perfectly depressed, like all of them. They're committing suicide, because they've thought about...
Right, which one is it that commits
Boltzmann.
suicide?
This guy is tragic, you know, his wife died, he couldn't do science anymore, he had to take care of all of his 6 kids, and that's when he comes up with this theory that the universe is dying.
I don't mean...
I don't laugh at that, but it's...
I don't mean to be like super depressing, but the universe is like so vast that compared to the death of one individual, it's really not going to affect it that much.
Well, look, I mean, the thing we have to really get at is that there's a political agenda here, okay? This is not real... Because what's happening at this period, right? This is the 1850s, 60s, 70s. What's occurring? And this is really important to not let ourselves get caught into some like scientific, historical lecture or something. What we've got is the almost destruction of the British Empire with Lincoln's victory over the Confederate South. Right? You have the spreading of Lincoln's system, this American Hamiltonian system, into Russia, into Japan, into Germany, into France. Every country that's been fucked over by the British Empire for generations is now recognizing that there's finally a solution, and that we can actually adopt a system based on improving the powers of labor, by increasing the amount of energy in the system forever, if you focus on developing the minds of your people. And so what's happening is the British Empire is collapsing, it's bankrupted the entire Confederate South operation, that failed. It was going through a depression, and an opposing system was taking over to destroy its control of maritime trade routes, everything else, so it was done. So when this ideology then becomes promoted, it's done with the intention to justify, well, what is the British doing to India, to Africa, to Ireland? Right? It's perfect entropy. Right? Of course you can't do anything better for Africa or for India. Of course we have to make famines happen. That's a matter of British free trade policy. Same thing for Ireland. We have to kill off the excess population. There's not enough food to go around. There's not enough resource to go around. It's part of nature anyway. You know, survival of the fittest. So this is not real science. They're actually attacking something which is much more reasonable. And the way this manifests itself in a clear way that people like Boltzmann gets across is to understand it and to see how this affects current, you know, this is going to come up in again, when you think about what's taught in cosmology today in physics. Well, he's saying, look, we have to use statistical gas theory. Entropy is like gas theory. When you imagine like an aerosol container, which I threw up here, you've got certain parameters defining what happens when you start applying heat to it. So when you start applying heat to an aerosol container, what do you think happens to the molecules inside of it?
Start to go green.
Start to go green.
Yeah.
Move faster, exactly. So all of a sudden you start getting pressure buildup, right? Now because that aerosol container itself is not going to get any bigger, there's going to be a tension that's going to increasingly build at that point. Now, at a certain point it's going to blow, right? You don't want to be anywhere near it. So what'll happen? Well, you're going to have, with the explosion, a complete eruption of the molecules in every direction, which will be bouncing off each other a lot at the very beginning. And as time goes by and as it spreads through the room, let's say it's a very big room, all of a sudden you're going to be having a tendency towards less singularities. There's going to be less bouncing off each other. And you're going to have an equilibrium. A basic stasis will begin to set in, especially if it's a really, really big, like a big monumental hall, right? Now, in entropy, the way this this manifests as the idea that, okay, look, we've got a big differential of let's say you look at something which is very hot and very cold, right? Hot water and an ice cube. You put the ice cube in the hot water, and at first you're going to have like a quick amount of changes in temperature, and that'll get more gradual as you have an equilibrium inside the water. And then all of a sudden there won't really be any more changes of hot to cold anymore, and it'll be a tepid, sort of boring blip. You won't really want to drink that coffee. So this is occurring in space, it's occurring in time, it's something which is directed, right? So if you're looking, well, what's the direction of the universe? You're saying, well, okay, I see this effect here in the aerosol container blowing up. There's a direction there. There's a direction in the machine, which is moving in a certain direction towards not moving anymore, stasis. In the ice cube in the water, there's a direction of stasis. So you say, okay, well, is that the way the entire universe is organized, towards stasis? Right? Is there just a Big Bang? Is that the best way to describe the redshift of galaxies, that there was a Big Bang sometime like 13 billion years ago, and from that point of chaos, you have all the seeming organizations of galaxies, of star systems, of planetary bodies that are all being organized by this, this blow up, to the point that galaxies are all moving away from each other, to the point that they'll stop having any gravitational effect upon each other, and they'll be so far away from each other that everything is just not going to happen anymore, right? Everything's going to stop affecting everything else, and you're just going to have a heat death. Because that is the logical extension of this way of thinking. Now, we've only been around for several, maybe a few 100,000 years. Civilization, as we've known it in written form, has maybe been known for maybe 10,000 years. So that small sliver of time, it's really difficult to start judging processes that are 13 billion years or more, based on something you saw with an ice cube or a gas theory. So as the American system is spreading and the British system is trying to justify its existence one last time, one last gaping breath, you have a very important individual. I've printed off some documents to give people a sense of who Vladimir Vernadsky was, who was born and who takes onto the stage of history. Vladimir Vernadsky, for those who don't know, is the founder of a school of biogeochemistry, one of the most important minds, student of Dmitry Mendeleev in Russia. He's Ukrainian himself. And some of the greatest revolutions in science occurred through this guy's direct intervention. And when he's a young man, he's still studying under Mendeleev, and he's taking on the bigger thought of how do you counteract the belief in a dying universe and its implications on human nature. Now, he's also very political. He's a member of he founds the Constitutional Democrats movement in his university. He's an admirer of Abraham Lincoln, as is his teacher Mendeleev. So he's got a very political intention. He's not just some ivory tower scientist. And he chooses to take on, as a point of attack, very early on, this is a letter in 1885 to his wife. He asks, what is time and space? And he's getting at what are the underlying assumptions that are causing a lot of these problems in thinking to become predominant. And he says, okay, well, underlying everything, we got this perception that everybody has of time and space. He says, what are they? These are problems that throughout the ages have interested the human mind in the form of its most brilliant representatives. No doubt, time and space do not exist in nature separately. They are inseparable. We know not a single phenomenon that covers no time and no space. Only for logical convenience do we imagine time and space separately, only because our mind is used to doing so while solving problems. In reality, we see time and space separately only in our imagination. To what do these inseparable parts belong? They belong to the only thing existing. That's provocative. The only thing existing. And this is going to be the seeds of his entire life's long devotion, which is going to span through 6 more decades of fruitful scientific work. And is always there at every step of the way. So obviously, when you look at any process that's changing in the physical material world, right, you have to presume that, just like that aerosol can, there's a certain idea of things happening, not all at once, right? So you have an idea of time. Otherwise, that's the thing that everything would just occur all at once and be very boring. And you have to look at some idea of space, right? Things happen in space. But these are not things that in and of themselves have intrinsic essence, he's saying. That they're the function of some higher process that we have to start appreciating more seriously. And he later goes on, as he founds the field of biogeochemistry in a very major work called Geochemistry. He starts developing this in a fun way. Using, again, what we went through. Don't forget the work on Carnot, entropy, all of these things. Because this is going to come up again and again. And Vernadsky writes, the spreading of living matter on the Earth's surface is one of its most surprising and exclusive properties. It is a sort of reflection of its gaseous origin. In both cases, we study statistics and the laws of gases, and the proliferation of organisms have much in common. Sorry, that's bad. In both cases, we study statistics, and the laws of gases and the proliferation of organisms have much in common. We imagine the spreading of gaseous masses and their resiliency as the result of chaotic, spontaneous movements of their molecules, which can only be stopped by an external force exceeding the combined force of the movement of all of these small bodies. Had this external force not existed, gases would have eventually filled all that given space. The same phenomenon is observed in nature, in the totality of the organisms. Had no insurmountable obstacle existed, living matter would, in time, have come to fill all available space through the spontaneous movement of all its indivisible molecules. If obstacles exist, living matter produces pressure analogous to the pressure of gases. So Vernadsky's simply saying, okay, we want to use the belief in gas theory and statistics and to try to understand living processes, and okay, sure, let's see how this actually manifests itself, because certainly there are certain commonalities, like he says, right? Just like a gas, if you don't stop it, it will tend to want to fill up more space, right? Like that aerosol can that just blew up. That gas, if nothing is stopping it, is going to just permeate and strive to fill more space until the point that, at a certain point there's obstacles like the very air around it and other things that cause it to simply stop and to settle down. Well, same thing for life. Because if you apply it to a life, what do you have? What he defines as the biogeochemical energy of species. So every species, unlike what Darwin says, which Darwin tries to explain these processes of evolution by looking at simple individual genetics randomly mutating such that, one species develops a better claw than another such that it can get food, it can have sex more efficiently than its enemy species in the battle for finite resources. Right? So that tension that Darwin observes in nature, that describes his approach to explaining how new species and new characteristics in life come into being, Vernadsky's is taking a completely different approach. He's not looking at individual units. He's saying, look at life as a whole. Life as a whole has this gaseous type quality of permeation, of yearning to seemingly spread across the given surface area in which it's located. He says it doesn't happen all at once, though. It doesn't happen because there's certain things that block it, right? These are two examples of certain extremes, right? If you go to the very small, you have things like these bacteria, which in some cases reproduce themselves almost at the speed of sound, such that if there were no obstacles to that bacteria's existence, because it does need food, it needs certain types of oxygen, certain types of environments to thrive based on its species character. But if it didn't have any of those obstacles, based on the surface of the globe as we know it, well, it would take only about 3 days for that species to fully fill all of the space on the Earth. But it doesn't do that, right? The elephant, in opposition, reproduces very slowly, one of the slowest of all the species. If it had no obstacles to its existence, it would take upwards of 300 plus years for the species of elephant to just fill up all the species of the Earth. I don't know if he's talking about the oceans too, that's kind of weird, but at the very least, that gives you a sense of magnitude. He says, well, you have the biosphere as a whole is in and of itself not always constant either. Most of the biosphere as we know it, and also things that we don't think of immediately as being living, like the atmosphere, are also or even the electromagnetic field of the Earth, are also effects of living processes on the Earth, without which you would not have an ozone layer, for example. You wouldn't have that free oxygen that life uniquely produces that gives and creates, in time, the formation of an atmosphere, an ozone layer, the ionosphere. These are all things which are being affected by living things. So this is why it's called biogeochemistry. It's not just geochemistry, not chemistry of the Earth, but it's how living processes shape the chemistry of the Earth. And this is an important reunification of sciences. So you have a tension. And he says, well, okay, this tension is undeniable, but really, where does it come from and what is the higher function governing it? Because we don't see these collapses. We don't see species coming back down to, in some cyclical way, back down to square one. We don't just see we don't go back to the amoeba stage every time that the species dies, right? So there's obviously something else going on. And he says, well, this pressure has a characteristic feature relative to a special state of the indivisible entities constituting living matter, which are only partly analogous to gaseous molecules. So it's not fully analogous. You can't just take the gas model of entropy and now apply it to life. That's not going to work. He says it's only partly analogous. The pressure of living matter is expressed not only in its movement, but also in its generational ability to change, which is absent in inert matter, in the adaptability of organisms. Throughout geological time, living matter adapts itself slowly. It frequently and successfully overcomes obstacles to its proliferation and undergoes corresponding changes during this process. So the simple pressure, the motion, the velocity of species permeating over the surface area of the globe, this is just quantitative. That creates a pressure, yeah, but it's not in itself more than a quantitative function. Gases are not going to qualitatively, just become a better form of more efficient gas, right? What you have, though, is in life, you actually do have things like mammals all of a sudden appearing onto the scene, whereas before there was no precedent for the mammals. You have photosynthesis appearing on the scene, whereas before there was no precedent for photosynthesis. So you have a qualitative change as well, which allows for the overcoming of these tension points. And when there's no creative changes, well, yeah, then you've got something that looks a lot like entropy. Now, if we take a step back and look at, Vernadsky describes gradual changes. Now, where's this? Adaptive, right. He describes how living matter adapts itself slowly, which was still generally, the general belief at that time in the 1920s when he's writing this. Now, in the 1980s, it was discovered more coherently that that doesn't happen, that there's no gradual change. There's always been a problem of missing links, but still there was no concise understanding of what is true if there's no missing links, but what does happen. Because in the 80s, you had a series of biologists and geologists who discovered that when you actually look at the fossil records in time, well, it's not like species are just disappearing, coming into being. It's not like some gradual approach where the one generation, the claw is that long, the next generation it's that long, the next generation. It doesn't work like that. Where all of a sudden then you have, what has big claws? Saber-toothed tiger or something,
Saber-toothed tigers aren't very well called. They do have the big sabers.
Okay, let's use that then. Big teeth. You don't have little teeth and then slowly, gradually bigger teeth. You have the appearance of new sets with new qualitative characteristics. And what was discovered is that, in fact, yeah, these things are being organized by major periodic cycles. So in opposition to Darwin, what's actually being demonstrated is that there is a higher order. It's not just chaos in the molecules that define new innovations in life. It's that you have some higher process of order, which we don't fully understand, but that defines when species disappear, when you have mass extinctions and cataclysms, and the new sets of species as a system which come into being. But still the problem is when you look at it, it looks still pretty entropic. It almost looks, if you look at, this is approximately the last 500 million years since the Cambrian, when you had an explosion of life from the seas. It still looks like that thing is, it's it's being governed by an equilibrium. If you just like imagine that thing going through, right? So that looks like some repetitive machine tool cycle that Carnot is describing, which applies to entropy, which puts us in a crisis. Maybe that's true. Maybe entropy is governing it. We all really are just going back to square one, and progress is just an illusion. It's pretty depressing. So yeah, no, fortunately that's not what's happening. So take a step back, you realize, okay, that cycle is actually a function of a much, much higher cycle.
Increase of what? Genera?
Of genera, yeah, the quantity of different species of genera in the biosphere and the fossil records over time. So what you actually have is not just a quantitative, there's not just more of them, but that the quality of these new species over time is also increasing. It's also changing. And now the big question arises, well, what's the law that defines that? Well, in what direction are these species moving towards? Right? So is there any invariable law that defines which species survive and thrive in the new system and which ones don't make it, which ones collapse in the old set with the cataclysm? So I don't know if you guys have thought about this yourselves or have looked into this at all, but okay. Well, one fun example, which we can look at, is the interesting property of major predators. So when you observe what species were dominating in the Permian and Carboniferous period, you had primarily amphibian fossils that we find. You know, where you sort of born as a tadpole, you live in the water most of your life, and then all of a sudden you grow some legs, and then you start becoming, you know, an above ground species. Well, that was what was dominating. Very big forms, but that was it. Now, at a certain point after the Permian ended, you had the Triassic, all of a sudden you got these really giant, you got Tyrannosaurus, you got all these dinosaurs all of a sudden dominating the system. And then that just comes to an abrasive end about 60 million years ago. And then bam, you've got a whole new set that's now formerly not really playing much of a role, but now that's dominating the new system, right? All these mammals, these bears, these saber-toothed tigers. So what's defining that? What's the difference between a mammal system and a dinosaur system and a lizard system or an amphibian system? What defines the difference of these different species? Is the question that, you know, the truth seeker would normally want to pose and work through. Right? It's all just random. It's just that the animals just got lucky, right?
No, they seem to have definitely. Sorry, they definitely seem to follow a pattern. Sorry if I wasn't sure.
Oh, that's fine. Okay. But they follow a pattern.
Yeah, they do. And the thing is that a lot of the dinosaur species, actually, I don't know if this is really relevant, but they weren't actually reptiles. They were discovered to have far more in common to birds.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else, and maybe embarrassing, especially since we grew up around like movies like Jurassic Park or everything else, but these creatures that we saw were actually completely covered in feathers.
That's probably true, yeah. Yeah. Now, the thing is, these things were also very, very big.
Yeah,
not that fast moving, like a Brontosaurus.
No, the Brontosaurus, the T-Rex, the interesting thing about it is that it was still to date the largest carnivore known. It's the largest carnivore still known.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, you know, you look at, well, these things, all of a sudden, bam, they were the king of the jungle, and then all of a sudden, no longer the case, right? And these little rodents and things all of a sudden find themselves now appearing as the new kings of the jungle and the new dominant set. So, you know, you could look at also, what else do the fossil records tell us? Well, over time, if you use the same process of the Precambrian to the present, you've also got certain things like the ratios of predatory and non-predatory species that we have in existence is over time moving increasingly towards a dominance of predator to non-predator proportions. Now, what defines the predator is, well, predators generally move a lot more than a non-predator. That's why, you know, they're the non-predators. They don't move around very much. They're easy to catch. Now, they also, because they move around a lot more, they require certain types of mental faculties, certain types of biological faculties, which require a lot more energy input. They're more energy intensive. They have to eat generally more.
They have to basically, because they also have to catch their prey. It's like if you're a cow, your food is grass. Grass is not going anywhere. If you leave it there for an hour, it's going to be there.
Yep.
If you're a predator, for example, you're a wolf trying to hunt a deer. If you look at one over there, you're hungry, you realize, I'll just come back to it after I go have a drink. No, that deer is probably going to be
Exactly.
long gone until you haven't
Yes.
been able to, think it's only going to go over here. I'll just, camp out near the water thing. There's bound to be one coming there, and then you just rush in at it.
Yeah. So the economy within the biology of a predator is got to be much more energy intensive than the economy within the biology of a what's another name for a non-predator? Prey. Thank you. Yeah.
Of course, not to say that prey species are friendly and non-violent.
No, not at all.
Those hippopotamuses,
Of course.
extremely dangerous.
Yes. Hippos kill more people than alligators.
Way more. And they run very fast despite being chubby Walt Disney creators.
Yes.
So, they run very fast.
They do, yeah. So what you got here is a tendency towards increasing the metabolic rate. Right? So if you're moving that much faster, like a hippo is, that hippo's got to eat a lot more food than, let's say, a jellyfish or something, and the metabolic rate, the power of the need to transform matter that's consumed as carbohydrates or whatever into usable energy to perform work is going to be more dense in every case. So when you look at the new ratio of animals with lower and higher metabolic rates, and you look at the minimum maximum in certain periods, like the Paleozoic, there's this period of plateaus that we see in the fossil records. There's 3 distinct plateaus from the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic that define certain constants. And if you take the minimum maximum quantity of fossils that we know about, you have a tendency towards increasing the density. Like the density is increasing, and the predominance of high metabolic activity animals, the lower ones, is also increasing in favor of the higher. So the lower ones their power to survive mass extinctions is generally lower than those of the higher form. So these are all very interesting properties. That's indicating, again, a certain direction, right? So just like entropy was pointing us in a direction towards no change, that all change is being governed, in a sense, towards yearning and striving towards a stasis point of no change. What you're actually seeing is that the opposite is the case when you look at the evidence in living systems, that points of very low change, like the early points in life, which are very boring, are actually being directed towards states of high change, of high creativity, right? High creative introductions of new species and new powers that those species express. So Vernadsky, in evaluating this process of the increasing complexity and power of life to increase its biogeochemical energy, to increase the power of atoms migrating through the biosphere because of life as an increasing process of change, he re-reflects upon the entire assumption in entropy, and he writes, this time in the essays on biogeochemistry, the other one was the essays on geochemistry, and if anybody wants these PDFs, I can send them to you. But he says, due to the existence of life, the entropy of the universe should decrease in biospheric phenomena and not increase. So entropy should not increase, it should decrease in biospheric phenomena. This empirical generalization brought about new speculations. Clausius's entropy really does not exist. Does not really exist. It is not a fact of being, but a mathematical expression, useful and necessary when it allows expression of natural phenomena in mathematical language. It is correct only as far as its premises are concerned. The deviation from Carnot's principle by such an essential phenomenon as living matter and its influence upon the biosphere shows that life does not stay within the premises for which entropy is stated. The essential fact is that life, in its most distinctive manifestations, is inseparably connected, like radioactivity, with the microscopic view of the world, where such regulations as those of thermodynamics do not exist. It is in the biosphere that this close connection of life with phenomena taking place outside the usual gravitational field must manifest most distinctly, as the connection of life with the biosphere is inseparable in the phenomena studied by us and manifests itself in the great migrations of Earth's matter. Now it's fun here because he's also bringing up how in the this question of radioactivity. So not only is he saying that living matter is not only anti-entropic, it's not, right, but it's connected to radioactivity. Because when you actually start thinking about what is making up life, what is making up the bacteria within us, the atoms within us, right? You've got energetic properties. You've got phenomena that are fundamentally being affected by, like bacteria are not being affected by gravitational fields very much. Yeah, if you get onto really like microbacteria, no, that you throw one out the window, it's not going to like die when it hits the 80th floor, right? So what you've got is the fact that there are, in the laws of thermodynamics, which he says here, where such regulations as those of thermodynamics do not exist, like in radioactivity. Well, this is, I didn't say this earlier and I probably should have. The laws of entropy are otherwise also known as the first and second laws of thermodynamics, right? Idea of fire, the changes in fire, right? Fire always increasingly moves towards heat death, right? There's not going to be more fire unless you put in more energy, more gas. Well, yeah, that's the second law, is that things move towards more entropy. The first law, he's saying, well, is disproved also by radioactivity because, well, the first law is what? It's that there's always a fixed amount of energy. There's a conservation of energy always in the system. This idea that nothing is created, nothing is lost, energy only changes. That was no longer, it was never really true, but it was really no longer true when Madame Curie discovered the properties of radioactivity. Because a rock, yeah, sure, I mean, a rock only has a certain amount of energy within it. You throw it, it's going to hurt somebody. It's based on the quantity of energy you put into it to launch it. But that rock, yeah, okay, sure, it's not going to do much more after it hits the ground. It's not going to start doing, it's not going to throw itself at somebody else. But if you find out that that rock is made of thorium or uranium, well, holy shit. All of a sudden you realize that the atoms making up that rock are themselves emitting many more times the amount of energy that you ever would have been able to get out of throwing it through a cannon or anything. Like this rock, if you tap that energy of uranium, you can literally power society for a year if you fully start using it properly. So, in fact, the idea that there is only a fixed amount of energy is really, or that there's a conservation of energy is really not true when you start looking at, well, what are the creative leaps that human beings made, like Madame Curie, to discover these deeper properties and then harness them to sustain greater quantities and qualities of people. But this does leave us with the question of how does this whole process help us redefine mankind? How is this an economic function in man? Since there is an economy in nature that we've identified is anti-entropic. Bless you. Well, with mankind, he also brings up the example here of iron. That when you look at mankind, yeah, you have Earth's migrations of matter, you have the creation of iron deposits, as we established earlier, as a function of bacteria and other small little microbes that use iron for their DNA, they use it for living things, and then because they tend to die at certain points, like in mass extinctions, you have the formation of iron deposits that is no longer diffused because of life's having organized these things and created things that we then mine in society. So human beings and the periodic table have a certain relationship. Now the interesting thing is, though life has that, also life more generally has a relationship to the periodic table of those elements we find in nature, which come themselves from the sun, it's not the same type of relationship. Because you guys all know that life relates to certain elements on the periodic table and certain elements it doesn't relate to, like living processes. Yeah.
Which ones doesn't it relate to?
Well, there's basically 7. Like life itself is pronounced for specifically like carbon, right? Like they call life a carbon-based thing. So carbon is a very important element in living things. No carbon, no life.
What part of it is it? Like what is it that it?
It's just in organic molecular structures you have carbon as an essential
that keeps molecular things together.
Yeah, it's coherent. You also have iron, right? If you have no iron in your body, you don't do very well. So of that, you have hydrogen, oxygen. No oxygen, no life. Silicon is also something which life is tuned to. You can think of it as tuning if you want, but the nitrogen is another. So there are these certain relationships that life resonates to with the periodic table that it needs and that it can build upon, but with human beings it's somewhat different because biologically we share these same characteristics of other species to the periodic table, but there's another function which, when you look at the greater idea of how the periodic table as we know it came into being, is changing. It's not just a fixed relationship, because up until 9,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, there were only these were the only elements that we have any record of having used. You know, copper, gold, lead, silver, iron, carbon, tin, sulfur, mercury, zinc, arsenic, and antimony. That was it. We didn't know of anything but that. So that was our relation to the periodic table of elements. It wasn't very periodic. Then even 1,000 years after that or more, between this interval of over 100 years, ending in 1789, there were still only 27 elements. And it took another almost 100 years to develop 69 by 1869. Today we know that there's over 92, right? A lot of these things are not actually found in nature. Like you'll find that the transuranics, those that are above uranium, like plutonium, plutonium, you don't even find those in nature.
You don't. You have to create them yourself. That's what's...
Exactly. But they're lawful. Yeah. Now, a paradox also arises when you look at this table, when you realize that this thing actually ends in 1869, when Mendeleev, a little bit before that, around 1867, discovered, or it was 1865, but when Mendeleev discovered the periodic table, this is Vernadsky's teacher, when he discovered that there was this harmonic organizing principle in all of the elements, he only knew of 69 total, but yet he was still able to discover this periodic table. Which, if you think about it, that's pretty, it's pretty miraculous. Because in chemistry, what do you guys remember ever taking a chemistry course in high school or anything?
I'm taking some right now.
You are. What do they tell you was organized in the periodic table?
They don't really talk about the organization.
They don't tell you why certain elements are found.
they're in groups because they have similar properties and it's all about electrons and weight.
Exactly. Electrons are the big one.
Yeah, I just took, the last time I took anything with chemistry was I took chemicals in our daily lives, and
Okay.
really did not have anything to do with any of this stuff.
No.
It was like, never mind.
That bad. No, that's what I've always gotten every time I bring this up in a conversation with anybody. It's always electrons. That's what everyone is being told is what you use to know what comes where in the periodic table. But in 1869, nobody knew about electrons. This is still at least 30 years before the idea of electrons even came into being.
But did they design it? Was it designed in that way? The periodic table? Was it shaped?
Yeah, in fact, when you look at Mendeleev's slightly different shape, but everything, the whole composition, the atomic weights,
same order.
Basically,
But they didn't know about electrons.
No, they didn't know about electrons.
Basically, Mendeleev, and I kind of saw this on a documentary, is he said to have been, he said he was inspired from a dream to make this. He knew that there were certain properties of minerals and material that basically the elements that range from this to this. So he arranged a table to fill in this stuff, and you realize, okay, we have this one here. There has to be logically stuff to fill in the blanks. And basically what happened after then is people finding stuff and to fit in the blanks. It was a very interesting...
The dream thing I have my trepidations about necessarily, I'm sure.
But anyways, whatever it was, the way how he came this up is that he was like a jigsaw puzzle. I know what's on the edges, now we just have to find what's in between.
Basically, he defines certain boundary conditions, yeah. What you made the point of that is very important, is that while looking for these qualities of the elements, because there's very different types of qualities you can think about. You could look at how they crystallize, what shapes they crystallize in. Some might be dodecahedral, some might be hexagons, whatever. What do they relate to, right? What do they bind with, and what do they not bind with? Right? Noble gases don't bind with much of anything. Right? You can look at a variety of ways later on. You can even look at spectroscopy later on. But the point being is, you can look at these different qualities and start developing an idea that there's a whole. You can't just start adding them together. You have to look at what are the whole, what principles as a harmonic whole govern their behavior. And as you pointed out, there were about 12 blank spots. When we only knew about 69, there were all of these blank spots all over this table, where he not only said something, like you pointed out, he didn't only just say something will be discovered here, but he also described what the properties, the weights, everything else would be of the unknown elements that had never been experienced by a single human being ever. He forecasted, and everyone said he was crazy, you're nuts, laughed him out of the office. But over the years, he was just proven true at every turn. And as the thing filled out, people realized, okay, there is a power in the mind to forecast the future based on a certain method. And that's what the oligarchy has been trying to crush, is what is this method, this successful method, that mankind resonates more perfectly with the universe, such that the universe responds by allowing mankind to have a greater quality and quantity of our own species into the future, and act on the future before things happen that we've never experienced before. Like, for example, people say, oh, an atomic war, that'll never happen, because it's, why? It's never happened before. Don't worry about it, right?
Yeah, it would have happened if Dwight D. Eisenhower hadn't basically restrained MacArthur over there, because they didn't, in the late 40s and the early 50s, I don't know if I'm interrupting.
Well, you're making a point, but I think overall, yes, there's been many points where we came very close, but you had wiser minds that thought the way Mendeleev did, that saw that, no shit, if we keep on this other way of thinking, we're going to destroy ourselves,
yeah,
and they didn't let it happen.
Well, anyways, the point what I wanted to make is, if they'd have used nuclear bombs again, it would have normalized the use of nuclear weapons, and it would have been just like dropping any other bomb, except you're going to have to be dealing with some unbelievable consequences over here.
Yes.
By making it the forbidden fruit that must not be touched, he effectively put a halt to, which is why there has not been a single use, after Nagasaki was bombed.
Okay. So the point being is, yeah, we've come to a point now where we're facing a global economic meltdown. We do have a danger of nuclear war, and the certain way that people are thinking is only accelerating that future to come into being, which means that ways that people, more efficient ways of thinking have to be recognized as being superior, and provably so, not just as a belief, but as a scientifically demonstrable view, such that the idea that mankind is a virus because our population grows geometrically, while other animal species in the biosphere simply cap their own population according to laws of entropy, right? Rabbit species and whatever other species, they always equalize their population growth because they don't make scientific and technological progressive discoveries. Human beings, we do these things, but what David Suzuki would say would be that's a proof why we are a virus. Because only viruses, aside from man, increase in this type of geometric way. But it's not just a quantitative thing, because when you apply, since the Renaissance, all of these discoveries, it's not just that the quantity of people increases, it's not just that the density of people increases, but that the life expectancy of people also increases. 100 years ago, you could only expect to live until the age of 43 on average in Canada. Today, on the average is different. If you look at also, a variety of factors, right? The quality of minds in your population, which is using thermonuclear fusion as an energy source versus coal, or even worse, windmills. That quality of mental development in your society has to be of a very high caliber to have a society that appreciates and understands the structure of the atom of material space-time, and then the energy that you harness from that, right, has certain qualities to it too. That means very smart people. So empires obviously don't like this way of thinking. And V.I. Vernadsky understood this. He understood that his ideas were going to have a geological force in history. And he points out human historical processes, or the historical processes, the historical process is being radically changed under our very eyes. For the first time in the history of mankind, the interests of the masses on the one hand, and the free thought of individuals on the other, determine the course of life of mankind and provide standards of mere ideas of justice. Mankind, taken as a whole, is becoming a mighty geological force. There arises the problem of the reconstruction of the biosphere in the interests of freely thinking humanity as a single totality. This new state of the biosphere, which we approach without our noticing, is the noosphere. So the revolution in method that Vronsky finally brought to bear based on his original attempt and his original hypothesis when he was a young student to find that what is the higher function that dominates the idea of space and time, which, because it dominates, it can't in and of itself be located in space and time, is a function that we can then call the noosphere. All right. Where do ideas of justice come from? Or where does justice come from, right? It doesn't come from, animals don't have battles over different ideas of justice. That's not how they do things. They go to battle for food, or you peed on my territory or something, right? So human beings form ideas like justice, but where are they located, right? Where in space and time will you find justice?
It's an abstract thought.
Yeah, it's not locatable in space and time as such, but it's something which has a transcendental quality, just like life, right? Where exactly in space and time is life? Well, I can see its manifestations in the plants and in us, but it, as life per se, doesn't seem to exist within space and time. It's something which is it's a universal principle. It's something that needs certain environments to express itself in a material form, but in and itself is not. So Vronsky describes how you can't be a biologist and you can't be an economist if you don't have an appreciation that you have a nested, what he would call phase spaces. You have non-living matter, right? All the material world organized by the absence of life, the material world, the biosphere, right? Where matter, carbon, these things are organized by life. Their modes of behavior are organized by life. And the noosphere, right? Where everything in this room, nothing was plucked off of a tree really, except for the apple behind Pascal. But everything in this room, including that apple, are functions of mind. Apples don't exist in nature, right? In virgin nature, without man, no such thing as this apple you buy in the store. So they're very like bitter, tiny little things that you don't really want to eat very much. Yeah, so most of the things, even in nature, are functions of mind organizing and choosing the free choice of rational minds to bring about certain effects, right? And this is part of the noosphere. And he's saying here that we have to now think about how, taking this broader idea of man's nature as a geological force in the universe into consideration when we're shaping our policies. And this is 1943, right? This is the heat of the World War II. And he's already thinking, okay, well, what lesson are we going to learn by our own almost self-destruction here during World War II? 25 million of his fellow, Soviet or Russians are dying to stop Hitler. So this guy's already thinking now, okay, well, the lesson has to be to use this crisis as an opportunity to redefine mankind in a legitimately scientific way. And if you think about this idea of creating new resources, well, right now, what is our hope? Well, LaRouche is constantly emphasizing thermonuclear fusion, right? If we don't start thinking about helium-3, this isotope of helium, which is barely on the Earth, but it's abundant on the Moon, and the Chinese know this. That's why they have a plan to industrialize the Moon and get it off, because they recognize the power and value of helium-3, but only if fusion is discovered. Because what's the value, right, back to the idea of value, what's the value of helium-3 without a knowledge of fusion? Zilch. Yeah. So all of a sudden we make the discoveries which are being made in spite of all the budget cuts, and the Chinese are committed to doing this because they know if they don't, they're going in for depopulation. That's why they're being destabilized by the British, and that's why the military confrontation with these countries is such a serious one. Because the British know that if these breakthroughs are made, then just like when Lincoln won the Civil War and that American system was spreading, the British Empire as a system is finished. It can no longer justify its existence with all of the breakthroughs that have been made. And the unleashing of the effects of this higher idea of human nature as a species which doesn't just consume nature, but actually can create, recreate, and improve nature is going to be defined. So I'll end here with one last quote to just cap things off here by LaRouche, who wrote, "The most essential of the preconditions for the political freedom which our federal constitution was intended to secure for us and our posterity is the commitment to an increase in the net physical powers of productivity of the means of existence, of a growing population of our republic, and, hopefully, a contribution of a kindred quality for other nations as well. On this account, there can be no other definition of wealth than the net increase of physical wealth produced per capita and per square kilometer of territory of our nation, and also our assistance to that same quality of end for the other nations with which our republic must cooperate, that done for the common ends on behalf of the general welfare of humanity as a whole. It is the nature of the universe, a nature which must be the guidance of all sane nations and their peoples, that our universe demands, as a condition for our survival, that we pursue a vigorously anti-entropic policy of universal practice, as for the case of fire, which only mankind among all living creatures practices, through a persistent increase in the energy flux density in the principal forms of action on which not only the progress, but the very survival of the human culture depends.
Can you just put it back?
Yeah, of course. Oops, shit. From print slide. Here.
I guess the only thing to say is, yeah, with human beings, it's all self-determined.
Mm-hmm.
Like, cause it was funny when you're talking about the prey and the predators. Like, you know, they depend. We're not in that whole thing, that whole food chain thing. But in a sense, discoveries we have to go after. We have to make them. You know, they're not going to make themselves. So we have to self-will to discover things that are already out there in a sense. But it's not going to come looking for us. We're not, you know, we're not naturally going to find it.
Yeah, right. And that's where you get like this stupidity of people who say, oh, space exploration, oh, the development of systems and the moon and Mars, haven't we colonized enough people on the Earth? Are we going to go and colonize other planets? And they think of colonization in this like very imperial way, right?
Yeah.
As if there were like little lunar men to colonize and enslave for the resources.
You know,
So the idea of like
one girl once brought out, I thought it was really funny, I think you were there, JP, she's like, what, so we're gonna go out on Mars so we can wage war against some fucking bacteria or something?
right there, yeah.
She was so pessimistic. She's like, what are we gonna go to Mars for? You know, so we can just go fight small bacteria so that we can take them over and rape and pillage their land.
Yeah.
You know,
what
like,
do we?
I think it's an important point because it would be easy, for example, to take the example of the growth of predators and to apply this to mankind, saying that we are getting more and more predators one against the other. But actually, this predator increase just shows, as you said, it shows that the rate of energy consumption of the animals on the planet increases. And instead of saying being stable or some falsehood like that. So yeah, so you got to think about the idea of change, not just like the real change, like more predators. But that's not really the point. The point is that you have more energy being consumed.
Yeah.
And that's a guide in how you know where to go in your economy. You need that increase of energy.
Yeah, right.
To make things better.
Yeah, and that's why also like one of the effects of making discoveries is that there's always you're now liberated to find all of these other paradoxes and make all of these other discoveries that you wouldn't have been free to make if that first hadn't been done, right? So that by hunting truth and applying the effects, the fruits of your hunt, right, of truth, right, that's what you're looking for if you don't know something, then all of a sudden, not only are you materially not burdened like an animal on the field, you don't physically have to do that much grueling labor like peasants in the medieval ages had to do to just subsist, or like Africans today are being told they have to do to maintain the empire. But all of a sudden you're free to start using your mind more so that you can pose more deeper questions and you can understand more processes about the universe, which then allow you to pursue that hunt, right? To be a healthy predator of truth. So it's a material mind relationship that we have to think about.
Well, there's also one other thing in regards to like space exploration and the pessimism behind it. It's when I think of this stuff, like people discouraging them, like I said, you know, they could have had nuclear-powered rocket engines over there that could have basically didn't need as much fuel. It could have just gotten off and on multiple times, you know, exiting the Earth's gravitational pull.
Yep.
The thing, what I like to think of it all and compare to this is if you look at various civilizations throughout history, and their downfall fell because of that idea. I mean, if you look at like the Chinese, for example, now the Chinese civilization was at one point the most advanced and the most powerful civilization on Earth. And what happened to them is they actually originally like had ships that were ocean-worthy ships. They moved as far west as Madagascar. They very potentially could have circumnavigated Africa and made it to Europe first in the 14th or even 13th century. But, you know, and if that happened, and if they were the ones who came to Europe and established trade on their terms, history would have been radically different. But they said they banned everybody from leaving the country. I mean, no, they didn't ban leaving, but they banned really exploration. And you have also the Aztec Empire, who expanded up until whatever they did. They thought, should we go over like to the seas and to the Gulf of Mexico or to the Caribbean, maybe see this magical land called Cuba or whatever, which is in today's world. They didn't do that because they outright said there's not there but savages and everything else what they found stuff. We have everything we need here. And guess what happened? Their lack of development in that field. And when the Europeans came, they didn't know how to react to that. Are we going to be invaded? I don't think so. But you know, we're going to find this is going to cause a downfall.
Yeah. Well, that's why the whole idea of the oligarchical principle is universal, right? It's not just the European phenomenon, nor is the Promethean idea of going outside your limits to make creative discoveries and share fire that the gods say man is not allowed to use. That's not a European idea either. You see it manifest in Indian culture, in China. So it's a human property, right? That we have change and no change, which coexist, right? Something about us all in the room is both changing and non-changing, right? Both materially and also more intellectually, spiritually, right? So physically, your identity as Salim is still Salim as it was 20 years ago. You're still Salim when somebody calls your name, you respond, right? Yeah. And you still have certain senses of identity which are the same, but yet over time, like materially speaking, most of your body is the cell, rejuvenation. All the cells that were in you then are long dead, and new ones have taken over.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't like the same foods, you don't like the same music that you did 20 years ago, but yet you've got something constant that's subsuming all of this change. Yeah. And in the universe, it's like that too, right? There's both change and non-changing, and the question we have to look at is which dominates which, and how do these things harmonize for a purpose of making things better? Because if we want to make things better, we have to choose. Well, what's the universe governed by? Like a state of equilibrium and no change, and all the changes being organized by this like deadness in the future, or is it life, which is fundamentally more changing than dead things, right? Is the universe characterized by a principle of life? And if that's the case, then we can't just treat life as something which happens here on the Earth, but we have to start treating it as a universal process, and start thinking, well, how does this redefine how we interpret processes like redshift, processes like the formation of stars, right? What are galaxies? What hold them together? Why are there similarities in the spiral nature of galaxies and the atomic structure within various elements? Right? What is an atom? So all these things, we have to just completely redefine them around a top-down idea of creativity. This idea of the noosphere, biosphere, abiosphere that Bernatsky was getting through. This is really important, and this is where LaRouche is saying, like, we can have a complete revolution in every field of medicine, science, energy, epistemology, if we can get Glass-Steagall through.
Just to make the point, though, because you kind of talked about entropy,
yeah.
In terms of life and the universe, but spiritually, that's really what you find in people every time they say, "Oh, it's always been like this. Oh, you can't change things."
Yeah.
It's just an entropic view of life, which comes from this kind of scientific method, which is the British Empire's method. It's the oligarchical method, and they just have no fucking understanding of history, and they don't realize that the way they think about things is it's a pathological. Yeah, it's pathological. It's just ideological. It has nothing to do with the way history has actually unfolded, you know, because many hundreds of years ago, the average person had no ability to read. You know, the literary rate was, you know, very low, but the average person can read today. If the oligarchy was so strong, you know, they would have never allowed that to happen.
Right.
But it happened.
Yeah.
So it's just an entropic view on no matter what you say, as long as ideologically they're committed to keeping that, you know, they're largely in health. And so you just kind of have to laugh at them and challenge them on, you know, look at the way the universe actually works.
Yep. Well, I'd say I'm going to leave people with a little bit of homework. We do need everybody here to work with us as much as humanly possible. One is a introductory piece by Vladimir Vernadsky on the noosphere. Right? The other one is a new piece by LaRouche on the incompetence of 20th century science education. So I think they work together pretty well. So leave that for everyone here to pick up a copy of each. But you know, we definitely need to just make this thing happen. And you know, next week we're going to be having a class probably by Harley Schlanger. We're going to have a lot of activities throughout the week. We're going to be intervening at the NDP convention on Saturday and then Sunday. There's a lot of things always going on. We have an EIR. One thing we always need is support. So to be able to do this type of outreach, you know, we need people like yourselves to be able to throw in contributions whenever you can. Pick up EIR, you know, copies which we publish every week. Read it, share it, and then organize with us because
Also,
we have not enough people out there.
With the free time people have, you know, they should just join us to organize. You don't have to know everything to challenge people.
No, for sure. Yeah, exactly.
Get out of the entropic way of life and become creative.
Yeah, that's it. That's a free will thing. So.
Sorry, just to wrap it up,
Yeah.
entropy, like, what would be like the final definition?
The crux of it?
Yeah.
The tendency to increase, the tendency for all closed systems to increase in or decrease the potential for change.
So it's a negative.
Yeah, the inevitability that the potential for change is always at a decrease to the point of absolute no change sometime in the future where it's like, this is the idea of 0 Kelvin.
Yeah.
You know, so that there's, which is in itself a bit of an absurd idea that there's like some point of coldness where it can be no colder, right? Where things just will never change.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, when you go to these extremes, like these near Kelvin temperatures, you find the opposite is the case. Things, yeah, sure, when they get colder, they change less and less, but all of a sudden, you start going towards like superconductors that operate in almost like 0 Kelvin temperatures, and they go super fast, right? So things don't get slower and slower. They actually hit a boundary condition, and they start going super fast. And it's like that for atoms too, right? Matter. When you start going smaller and smaller, yeah, sure, things get a little bit more boring. There's less of the matter that you're looking at, but you get to a certain point of just getting down to the very small, and bam, you start getting processes that can blow up mountains, right? Like an atom all of a sudden can do a lot of work. It totally disobeys all of the previous laws of physics.
That's why splitting the atom is possibly the biggest discovery of the past 100 years.
Yeah, right. So, you know, what you want to do is look at the extremes. And what the oligarchy does is they say, no, obey your extremes and adapt to the conditions within those extremes, right?
I have, I'm not very too politically or scientifically literate, let's say, but on just an intuitive level, it's very see-through for me, like just the whole general agenda. And I guess you can see it mostly when you start thinking creatively about your, let's say, dietary decisions or just media consumption, and then you start realizing what's being forced upon you is lies. So that's when you start realizing that.
Yeah. Everyone comes at it in a different direction, but it's always the same conclusion.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, because you could stop eating the food that makes you obese. You have this obesity problem, but still, then you gotta, if you want to feed the whole world, then you gotta get to a different level of action, which you go from your own health to, okay, how do I make the health? You have most people on the planet can't eat. Everybody's malnourished almost.
Yeah, because even obesity can result from malnourishment.
Sure.
It's not necessarily that you're not getting enough calories, it's just getting the wrong kind of calories.
Well, yeah, that's what they call poverty diets, right? People just can't afford it. Based on our shitty consumer economy, people don't have the means to purchase real food, so they have to eat Twinkies and shit and McDonald's.
Well, it's kind of it's ironic when you think of it, because it used to be that poor people would have to be thin. It's like reached the point in which poor people are actually kind of fat now.
Yeah, that's the idea. What like JP just said. You know, when we make breakthroughs on like our own individual level, our own creativity, our own, you know, what's holding what oligarchical habits in the culture around us are holding back our creativity. When we become self-conscious of that or our own health, and all of a sudden choose to make a discovery of something outside of the habits of the culture, all of a sudden we're then led to the next step, which is, okay, I'm part of a species. I am integrated with my species as a whole, and I'm seeing all of a sudden that there are these obstacles holding back Africa, India, my own culture, right, from having a future on all these different levels. And then you can immediately say, okay, based on my discoveries, now I have a standard of truth because I made a discovery. Now I can use that to penetrate through all the misinfo and bullshit out there that other people fall prey to because they've never made a real discovery. They've only memorized shit. And so then you can start problem solving on that higher Vernadsky, LaRouche level, which the oligarchy, they just hate it when people like us do this. So we should just do more of that. Fully conclude
It's
that
not
that's...
necessarily self-evident though as well with the supply and demand for...
No, I'm saying that if you think it through, the conclusions of belief in supply and demand and monetarism.
You know, I'm saying for anybody who doesn't necessarily know what those things are, it's not...
Okay, well, this itself is not self-evidently not true. Like, does anybody here see why it's really hard? It's somewhat hard at first to...
many times.
Yeah, but it's somewhat hard to disprove that. Like, do you find it difficult? Yeah.
Well, my argument will be it's the manner in which you consume can also be altered, and the way you live, and like the way you manage your environment. Not in terms of this is population reduction is the answer, I guess, that he's suggesting. But I mean, if everybody starts being careful about their trash, you won't be living in a trash pile, for example. There's ways to change behaviors, not change the population amount. That's it.
And,
that will just retard the moment where surpopulation will still be a problem, you know?
well,
Hold on, Salim. One second.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But if you imagine, like, you're saying, like, if the population was completely fixed right now, right? Like, it's stabilized, no more growth of population, but everyone just was more careful about how they consumed and wasted, we could avoid this type of conclusion?
Well, I mean, like what I would say, like, I don't want to take too much of the floor, but
okay.
what I would say is the most important need we have is, let's say, food. I would think, in terms of resource, it's food, and right now we are not producing food in like the way we're producing food is by far the most efficient way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So why not focus on that before thinking, okay, well, there's not enough food for everyone. Like, I would think.
Even if you have, like, the certain quantity of food production that's more wisely done, and let's say we did everything else wiser in terms of, like, our relationship to water, fossil fuels, the ores that make up our life. Even if we were doing them in the wisest possible ways, but maintained a certain relationship to the quantity of fresh water available and the quantity of fresh ores and stuff like that available, even if that was done at the best, the fact is that by virtue of just sustaining a population in time, requires these things to still disappear in time.
What does that mean also by the best? Because with our current technology, it's not the best. So we have to advance the technology.
Well, I guess self-sustained, like a technology that would create self-sustaining production, right?
And that's why there's no real such thing when you actually look at the fact that if you don't improve your technology, get out of your fixed technology base, if you don't do that to something more efficient, then you will always create a collapse point sometime in the future. You can maybe push that collapse point down by conserving more or whatever else, or readjusting an immaterial process. And that immaterial process, what allows it to improve is not the technology itself. There's something else. There's a certain concept, a certain quality or power of mind, which we're going to have to get more familiar with. Now, who's somebody who doesn't believe in that power of mind? And what is the effect of the thinking if you don't believe in the power of scientific and technological progress? What opinions, if you follow through your logical consequences of not believing that there is this power and that this is what defines human nature? Well, you're going to be thinking a lot like this guy. Now not everyone has taken this to the logical conclusion, but some people have, and for those who have, it's useful to just read their writings and think how they are thinking. So, everybody knows who this guy is, right?
yeah.
Okay. So the guy who said that he'd like to, if he were reborn in the next life, come back as a deadly virus to solve overpopulation, wrote in an spoke in an interview to People magazine that human population growth is probably the single most serious long-term threat to survival. We're in for a major disaster if it isn't curbed, not just for the natural world, but for the human world. The more people there are, the more resources they'll consume, the more pollution they'll create, the more fighting they will do. We have no option. If it isn't controlled voluntarily, it will be controlled involuntarily by an increase in disease, starvation, and war.
Yeah. That is exactly what Thomas Malthus said.
Mm-hmm.
And if he wants to be born, and he wants to be reborn as a deadly virus, I want to be reborn as the cure of this guy. That way I can like inject it and like I can just like strangle him in this virus form.
It's good.
It's also interesting that he says we have no option. It's not.
Yeah, it's not a maybe. It's a very
it's not like
absolute.
he's not saying, oh, we have pollution problems, or because it's true. If you take all the oil, then there's no more oil left. That's a fact. But we know better. But he says there's no option to this.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you going to do? Well, you can control your people, since you can't control their tendency to grab resources. Control the people.
Okay. Now this is not. It's at first experience, at first sight, this is somewhat gross for anybody with a bit of conscience and a bit of morality. This is somewhat disturbing and dissonant to listen to. But if you think about it a little deeper, it's not always the easiest thing to immediately refute. Like, who here wants to believe that?
Si tu crois à l'offre et la demande, right?
If you believe that, yeah, if you believe in supply and demand and monetarism, yeah, you're probably going to necessarily have to conclude in that. But how would you... I mean, people today very frequently say, money makes the world go round, without Wall Street there's no economy. Now, if you think about it a little bit, you realize, no, gravity makes the world go round. If you have an economy, it means that, if you get rid of all of the engineers, yeah, then you don't have an economy. If you get rid of Wall Street, well, that's a bunch of financial services. There's nothing really being provided. If you look at what sustains our productivity, our human population stability, the financial services aspect of the economy really has very little to do with that. If anything, it's a parasite sucking that down. So there's no real value in that sense when you think about the real parameters defining life and human life on top of that in the universe, in money. And not that long ago, people understood that. It was, I like using this anecdote, but at my grandmother's house, she has a set of encyclopedias that were published in 1969. And in that set, there's a description under the heading of Mars, which describes how by the year 1984 or maybe 85, the first colony should already be established according to those policies then in action in that point. Keeping in mind that in 1969 was a year following the first human being actually stepping foot onto onto the moon. All of the program of John F. Kennedy wasn't yet destroyed, both on the nuclear fusion investment orientation nor in the broader space-based economy orientation, which were the norm. And that was what drove the economy. And when you were doing that, and people were actually in a state where you were always thinking about how to make things better, it was very difficult to fall into the trap of believing that, oh, money is the source of my economy. No. Your children, your science, what are you doing for the future is the source of your economy. And so what we're facing today is really a crisis, not so much, well, we do have a physical crisis. Yes, our infrastructure is breaking down. Yes, people are getting stupider. Yes, we are facing a war. So we do have certain real physical parameters that are a crisis. But the real root of these crises, none of these would be crises were there not a deeper problem in thinking. Certain concepts which today have become standard doctrine, popular opinion, which people calibrate their behavior, their plans, their self-identities to, are based on provably fraudulent assumptions about fundamental ideas of the universe, both of the nature of man, the nature of reality, perception, government. So there's basic ideas which organize the invisible structure processes. Thus, when we gather up and employ iron ores, we are depleting the density of the forms of ores left behind by long-deceased expressions of life concentrated in certain environments in this manner. You know, he's talking, you guys all see that in nature? Okay. Hence, to overcome the loss of richness of such resources left behind, we must act in ways which have the effect of increasing the equivalent of the energy flux density of the sources of heat power applied to production for human needs. This pattern of proceeding from raw materials and heat processes of relatively lower to higher orders of energy flux density has been the basis for every case of the society's ability to maintain its population's ability to maintain an improved or even a constant level of potential relative population density. That is a mouthful. Did everyone generally get the idea, or should I maybe extrapolate a little bit of what he meant? Basically, when you're facing any new iron ore deposit or any ore deposit, at first it's going to be somewhat easy to extract what's there. It's going to be a very dense bulk, so it's very easy. Now, but if you continue using a certain low-level set of technologies to extract it for whatever needs your society has, then at a certain point it'll become more and more diffused with other, rocks and other soils and things that make it really hard to make it economically viable to continue that process. And you abandon the mine or whatever, right? You just have to leave it. Now, if you come up with a new technology by developing a better form, a new technology that uses a greater density of heat, all of a sudden you have more freedom to start extracting these irons or what have you that you would normally otherwise have to abandon with a lower source. But the fact is that these things are always going to be, on the one hand, limited. If you always just stay with one type of ore, you're fucked, right? Because there's only so many ores to go around, and at a certain point, these things will collapse. And you have to also recognize that as you move from these new technologies, from something lower of a lower quality to a higher quality of heat, well, your population is going to have some effects too, right? Your potential to sustain more people is going to increase, not decrease, with these innovations, right? So people could say, well, okay, that's technology. I don't believe in technology. Technology is destroying the world. Right? Look at Africa. Isn't that caused by technology? If we weren't raping all the resources, wouldn't they be in a utopic place? Well, no, that's not true, because what you're looking at, what's causing technology, right? Technology is not a thing in and of itself. It's an effect of political and economic law that define our existence, which are provably absurd, and yet because people have developed a very lazy-minded set of behavioral patterns through a really shitty culture, shitty education system, which shouldn't be too shocking for if anybody's actually here and thought about this. Because of that, they are not looking deeper beyond the surface of things and are not judging through their own powers of reason the absurdity of these assumptions. Money being valuable is one of them. There's a variety of others. Now, LaRouche laid out a very, very tight introduction, at the very least, for I think most people, to his general epistemology and that which makes this organization very unique in history. Oh, sorry, Dave, what?
No, sorry.
Okay. And the point that I'm going to try to introduce in the class will be to just add a little bit of meat on the bones, because it requires a lot of work. To hear this is one thing, to believe it is another thing, and to actually understand why this belief is actually more reasonable than anything else is yet another thing still. So what we're going to do today is just to take a little journey through a proof using a series of resources on the imperial fraud of entropy and why the idea of value needs to be redefined around a competent conception of natural law, and that natural law could in itself only be proven if it is understood that entropy is false. Who here knows what entropy is? Who has come across this word before? Who is not a member? You've come across this word? Not come across this word?
I was going to ask the question what it is.
Beautiful, okay. All right, I'm not going to answer that right yet, but I'm going to jump on that. Okay, so I'll begin by taking two key quotes at the beginning of my class here just to create a certain counterpoint, a contrast of the effects of a concept that is rooted in a belief in entropy and anti-entropy. The fact that we just listened to LaRouche also, yeah, sort of puts us in the place of the anti-entropy mindset. But let's use this quote here from 2011 by Mr. LaRouche, which I'll then counterpoint to one other person as the opposite of that. So on the nature of men, okay, LaRouche wrote, and has been trying to explain for a long time, that most of the raw materials on which civilization depends today are found in fossil remains, such as iron deposits, left behind by deceased forms of what had been living